Welcome everyone to the Agile Online Summit. I hope you're having an amazing time. I am here joined with my colleagues, John and Jason, to talk today about the distraction dilemma. In the spirit of that, if you all have your phone handy, will you please take it at arm's level extension with everything on silent and set it off to the side so that we can be as distraction free as possible today. We'll go ahead and jump right in since we have a short time together today and a lot to get through. So my name is Kate Visconti. I'm the founder and CEO of 5-to-Flow. I'll do some introductions of my colleagues more in detail here in a moment, but wanted to just hit the agenda today that we're going to go through a few introductions and a major theme that we're seeing in our ecosystem in technology and digital transformation consulting and execution. We want to share a familiar story that many of you, I'm sure, have witnessed and been a part of yourselves, and talk a little bit about the science and impact of distraction and lead into a new way of working and of living. Today, we have John Collins, the president of Acellas on. Hi, John. Want to say hi to everybody?
Hey, everyone.
All right. And as I said, I'm Kate Visconti, founder and CEO of 5-to-Flow. And with us today, we have Jason Haller, our managing director of 5-to-Flow, who will be moving into the title Chief Performance Officer as we think about how performance is so important in our organizations today. So Jason, thanks for being here with us today. We wanted to talk to this team first about why we're here today, why it's so important to have this talk about distractions. So over to you.
All right. Well, I think where we wanted to start was first by addressing the issue of why we are dealing with more distractions now than in the past, and to kind of put some data to quantify that this is a new problem. You know, people in the 1950s didn't have to meditate or do things to avoid distractions. Life was just simpler and less distracting. So we've got some data on the screen here. Since the 1980s, communication person to person has increased almost 30% year over year, which is 5 times more than the US GDP has increased year over year during that time. So that's a rapid increase in how much we're bothering each other with distractions and communication. And in 1986, the average Westerner was exposed to the equivalent of 40 newspapers per day. And by 2004, that had jumped to 174 newspapers per day. And that was before smartphones and social media took off. So it's far higher now. So we're just rapidly accelerating in terms of the amount of information that we're forced to process per day. And then the time that we get to process each piece of information is dramatically dwindling. So we're switching tasks way more rapidly than we used to, which is causing us to train our brains to focus less on one thing at a time and then move quickly to the next thing, just because that's the environment that we're all living in. And then on the right, we're introducing this concept of attention residue. So if you do get distracted while doing some kind of cognitively challenging task, it can cost 20, 25 minutes worth of time before you return to that same level of focus and cognition. And we see that college students are task switching every 65 seconds, office workers every 3 minutes. And most office workers don't have an hour per day uninterrupted, and CEOs have even less. So, you know, we're in big trouble here, and hopefully we're going to address some of these issues and what to do about it over the rest of the webinar.
John, what do you think about this great acceleration and cost of task switching as a CEO yourself? Any reactions to that?
I think that we have to do something. I don't think a choice. I think there needs to be a response to this dramatic increase. This volume, this new volume of information that we're expected to process. I think we'll get into specifically what, in my experience, I've done, Kate, what you've done, Jason, what you've done, and when the rubber hits the road, some tactics that are available to all of us to respond to this, because if we don't, we're getting buried. I mean, everybody on the call now or on this webinar now has felt buried, and I'd be surprised if there were someone who has on the call or a webinar now who hasn't felt buried already once today?
Yep. So feel free in the Q&A box to put questions in there, little reactions on your screen for us to see if you want to ask a question intermittently. But I'm curious, Jason, what of these distractions, how that's impacting productivity? We've got developers, Agile, Scrum leaders, product owners on this call today. They're at this summit. Let's talk a little bit about these distractions and how it impacts productivity, because in the tech space, we're really measured by, number of user stories we execute on, how many sprints we complete, we're on time, on budget. Tell us a little bit more about these.
Right. Well, we definitely need to establish that distractions are a bad thing, because we could be totally distracted, like I just pointed out, and we're just as productive and no big deal. But that's not really the case. In general, distractions are going to slow us down, increase our stress, and reduce our quality of work and productivity. And then with that in mind, we have some nice attributes on the screen here. So a study that was done showed that even a 3-second distraction, so like simulating the quick check, like, did I get an email notification? Did I get that response I was looking for? That doubled error rate when distracted or multitasking were an average of 10 IQ points lower, which is the same as missing an entire night of sleep. We're taking longer to complete tasks, 27% longer according to one study, and at the cost of twice the anxiety of completing that task without distractions. This leads to a ton of the time spent at work not being spent productively, because we're either recovering focus from getting distracted, or we're just working slower and less productively when we're working. And this is leading to a huge estimate of money being lost to US businesses annually, and you can extrapolate that across the world. That was just based on US businesses. And one study tried to figure out what the equivalent of full-time employees was that you would need to add in order to make up for the distractions. And it was essentially, 3 employees for every 10. So if everybody worked, and this is relevant because a huge complaint that people have recently is we're understaffed, we don't have enough time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, apparently there's 30% extra time just laying around because of distractions, that if we were less distracted, we could recover. And later on, we'll talk about flow and be way more productive. And then maybe a huge chunk of that, we're understaffed and we don't have enough time, kind of just resolves itself purely by resolving the distraction issue.
Yeah, and we have in the chat already what comes up for Chris is that they have to deal with this all the time, where they have to do more with less time, and prioritization or saying no becomes critical. So we'll definitely talk about that, Chris. And I love that you mentioned that, because this particular stat at the bottom, really thinking about feeling short staffed, when really if we were as productive as we could be, we may not be, and we would have more time for more strategic work, right? So Jason, why don't you tell us a little bit about how this shows up for everybody? And one of the things I'd love for you to talk about is like giving ourselves grace and not feeling alone in this dilemma. Like, what are you seeing in your research here around today's average worker?
Well, I'll just invite everybody to check out the screen and look for just 2 or 3 stats that jump out at them. I mean, this is the result of the current paradigm, which is based around rushing and multitasking and getting notifications, which are distractions, and always being on. And this is the result. So I would say if I was running a business and this is what I expected out of my employees, I would probably pay them a lot less, right? This isn't very productive. Or if this was me and I was expecting this out of myself, I'd be pretty disappointed too. So just take a quick peek. I'll probably point out a few that stick out to me. Kate and John, you can do the same. But
yeah, John, I was curious for you, which ones stick out the most in your ecosystem?
I mean, this chart is just so depressing. I'm trying to find one. 56 disruptions a day, I think, is light. I think that's maybe, for me at least, is an understatement. 36 email checks per hour, maybe not so much, but I don't check my email as much, but a big portion of that has been because email has been supplanted by so many additional channels of professional communication.
Yeah, that number was from an older study, and it's probably less email checks, more Slack, more internal, like, Google Chat, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, this
All
is
right.
just dumpster fire of a chart.
Well, for anyone on the call, I'd be curious, feel free to put in the Q&A box which ones resonate most with you. I was so shocked when I read this, but one of the ones I have to be honest with myself and like where I do want everybody to feel empowered is if 44% of our distractions are self-inflicted. We really want to make sure today we give you some tips and tools at the end. So hopefully you'll stay in with us undistracted while we share a story. So John, Jason, and I wanted to tell a familiar story. John, why don't you tell us about It Just Works, this amazing company you're a developer for?
Yeah, this is a result of some flow states that I had last week, which, don't judge, our flow pitch on this. A hypothetical situation I'm sure a lot of the people on a lot of the attendees here can relate with. Just a fast growing company, with all the right ideas, that is engineered for growth and see some success. And, through that success and the recognition of that success, some growing pains and getting to a point where they want to grow and they're looking to go to an IPO for an initial public offering. And they find out that, to go there, there are certain really formal boxes that I think a lot of attendees here can relate to that they need to check. And after having grown so quickly and going through that process of rapid growth, they had not checked those boxes, but those are absolutely prerequisites for going for an IPO. So they make a decision to spend a bunch of money on a project to check those boxes. And that's the background.
All right. So we wanted to make sure everyone on the team and on the call today felt part of this project. So we're just going to do some role play through this story. Jason will be our Scrum Master. I'm the product owner. Hilariously, I'm currently on a tech implementation project right now where there is no product owner. And so we're struggling for even more reasons than we show here. And then we've got our developer, John. So I'm going to breeze through some of these bios, but we all know we've got different people on our team. If they're bringing their whole selves to work and they're able to really focus, reduce cognitive load, which we'll talk about in some other sessions. But we have the Scrum Master who's here to make sure that we can focus the team and do that prioritization that Chris mentioned. I'll play the part of the product owner on this project. I have the big sense of humor, bring comedy to that bit, and make sure that we're laughing through this project. And John, our developer, who's been at many startups, busy dad, I'm sure those are 44% of your distractions during your workday, especially throughout COVID as we were all working from home and trying to really focus as we come to a project charter like this. So I'm sure you can resonate. Feel free to put in the Q&A box or some comments when you are put onto a project with really ambitious goals, unreasonable timeline. I've got one going live in a couple of days that isn't even through UAT. Our stakeholders have kind of gone dark on us. And we've got this really lean team where we're just basically feeling like we're the ringleader of the circus. Right, John?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it would be tough for me to remember a project in which that didn't line up exactly like this over 15, 20 years. It's unfortunately.
Awesome. So for each of you on the call, think about a project you've been on that was like this, super ambitious, unreasonable. We've got go live dates not based on a compelling event. We've got ancillary systems, and we've got all these distractions. Multiple teams were running. Some of your sponsors on the project are just doing this in addition to their day job. So we get to this point, this major dumpster fire, car crash, whatever analogies you all use. We're already behind schedule. We have scope creep. We're burning over budget. Our test results are bringing tons of errors in. We don't have change readiness. The sponsors are nowhere to be found. And now we have this no-go decision that we have to make. So I wanted, Jason, why did this happen? Like, as we go into projects, if we're well prepared and ready, tell us a little bit about how we got here.
And Kate, Jason, do you mind if I jump in real quick too to frame?
No, feel free. Yeah.
Could you go back to the last slide because I love it so much? I mean, there's if you guys are here right? You probably listen, as I do, to Vasco's podcast, and like there's some, at least for me, and I've been passionate about agility and even scaled agility to some degree, but just working better and building, being a servant leader and being a team member who's collaborative and, you know, actually figuring out a way to get to real value and tackling some of the really hard problems. And that's, I think, why I'm here, and I think probably why you're here too. Is you probably get up in the morning, like I do, and the reason I get excited is because there are these problems that, you know, to solve that are really human problems, right? And a lot of what we touched on in the slide before, I there's a lot of sessions out there, after product owner, like just lean team, mixed skill sets, certain, you know, as you guys know, personalities, right? A single personality that is really, really strong, like as a scrum master, as a team member, stuff like that. You know, there's no shortage of challenges that we need to overcome, right? Really ambitious goals, unreasonable timeline, the decision makers for that timeline really aren't stakeholders, all these different things, right? And as I pass it back off to Jason, I want to be clear, like this context and in this situation that I think a lot of you, I'm very familiar with, right? On this, the framework of this webinar is not how to solve all of those problems, right? Because that would be all webinars, 24 hours, 150 years, and maybe
I don't think it'd be free either.
right, I know. But I think the way that we're framing this is we can use different tools to solve those problems. And there are some of these problems that are so, and you guys have probably experienced, so fundamental up at a larger client or in your own organization, all the way up at the C-suite or something like that. And getting there and influencing to make a change may either seem immediately impossible, or may be, depending on the situation, impossible. So then the question becomes, you know, what can we do? And I think what we'll get into and what you'll start to see here is that we might not be able to solve all those problems, but the problem of distraction is such a big one that if we're able to chip away at it and make some inroads there, like the impact that we'll see, even under some of these conditions, can turn a project around. So I'm sorry, Jason, back to you.
I love that.
Just to tie a knot in what John was talking about, as you know, with regards to problem solving and distractions, if we lose the ability to solve problems when distracted, then solving the problem of getting distracted is step one, right? So that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to insulate and protect your ability to pay attention so that other problems can get solved downstream. That's kind of the crux of this whole thing, right, John?
No, absolutely, you nailed it. That's a perfect thing you did. First, you have to take care of this.
That's right. So in response to the last slide where we said, why did it happen? We're going to introduce this concept of ADT, or attention deficit trait, which is basically ADD or ADHD, but environmentally triggered rather than having a genetic developmental component. This is just our brain's response to this hyperkinetic, distracted, multitasking, rushing lifestyle. And so if you think of like type 1 diabetes being the kind of inherent, you know, genetic one, and type 2 diabetes being more lifestyle driven, ADT is the lifestyle driven version of ADHD. That's kind of how you want to think about it. And that's just our brain's response to the type of environment that we're putting it in. It's protecting itself. It's trying to learn what it needs to do better. But that is kind of detrimental to our ability to focus on something for a long period of time and do this more deep level of problem solving. So when the demands on our time and attention exceed our cognitive capacity, our brain gradually loses its ability to attend fully and thoroughly to anything, because we kind of are trying to stay on alert. Like, what other problems do I need to be aware of right in this moment? Where are all the notifications? Where are the distractions I'm looking for? So we adapt to be looking for those distractions rather than adapting to stay honed in and focused on one thing at a time.
Right.
This makes us more easily distracted, more reactive and impulsive, less self-aware, and worsens the quality of decision-making. This diminished executive function is the definition of ADHD for anybody that's interested, makes everything you do feel harder and more taxing than it needs to be, thus perpetuating the cycle of exhaustion and reduced performance. Your mind stays locked in a state of overstimulation, making you tired, anxious, and prone to irritability, but unable to relax. The unable to relax part is super key. I've dealt with tons of clients, personal coaching clients that is just like a super obvious, attribute that's like, yep, I know what we're dealing with here. You need to go sit in a sensory deprivation tank and just, be uncomfortable for an hour.
Yeah. Well, John and I were just talking about our meditation before the call and whether we did or didn't make it. Right. So it's when I try to meditate, I get a little spun out on all the stuff I need to work on. So I'm sure that leads to this overstimulation.
Yeah. And let's go to the next slide so basically when we're distracted and we're in this hyperconnect environment, this is going to cause kind of a baseline level of stress. And then when we are exposed to that stress over a long period of time, it actually changes certain attributes. So it's going to have a physical issue where we're now dealing with more metabolic dysfunction, higher risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, poor immune function, et cetera, et cetera. But also the chronic stress increases the size of the amygdala in your brain. This has actually been measured. It's totally proven and it's terrifying. But the amygdala increasing in size actually makes you more susceptible to fear and anxiety and worsens impulse control and creates a tendency towards black and white thinking where shades of gray and nuance disappear. So if you're going to be a quality thinker and quality problem solver, you need shades of gray, you need nuance, you need to be able to have an in-depth discussion. You can't just be jumping to whatever the extreme conclusion is that's the first thing on the table. And so this is going to directly impede your ability to get into flow and make sound decisions.
So I'm curious for all the attendees, and John, did you know that this could happen? Like that we actually have physical outcomes from our work stress like this? And anyone in the session, feel free to put in the Q&A maybe some of your thoughts on that. But John, what do you think?
Yeah, I had known, and I've been a mindful practitioner and going to retreats and stuff. I've always been a Sam Harris fan too. He comes from a science background, right? And so he, it's some of his books like The Moral Landscape and stuff like that. He talks about the neurology or neuropsychology of how this stuff works. I think I'd been aware of it when we were preparing for this webinar, though, in walking through it and really thinking through it in this context. Jason, you blew my mind. I'm sitting here and I'm connecting things, and I'm connecting the way I work, and I'm connecting the hours that I spend in a day, what I get done, and then the quality too. Like, it's not just the volume of stuff you get done, but the quality of the work that I do. And I've in the last week and a half or two, I've changed the way that I work because it was that much of wow.
Yeah. All right. So I wanted to take a moment, Jason, to have you walk through this distraction life. When you think about how it's showing up for folks on the call, and I'd love everybody to put in the chat your number, like which one you're seeing resonate most with you right now while Jason talks through these. So we talked about ADT. What's hurry sickness?
So hurry sickness is, because all these terms are new, as these are kind of new neurological phenomenon. So somebody on one side of the world may study something and name an ADT, and somebody else may be studying the exact same thing on the other side of the world and call it hurry sickness. So it's very similar, slightly different, but actually a study done on hurry sickness found that 95% of the managers studied had hurry sickness. So I loop in hurry sickness just to show how prevalent ADT and hurry sickness probably are. But yeah, we're looking at, short-term memory being affected, your ability to pay attention, your ability to learn. Long-term, we discussed the health outcomes and the brain, the neuroanatomical changes from the previous slide. and how this undermines our ability to get into flow, which is our best performing, but also our best feeling state. So if we are dealing with a massive increase in anxiety and depression, especially in the corporate world, lack of flow is not like the cause, but it could, lead to the solution, right? If we can perform better and feel better, then that's a hell of a lot better than being distracted and anxious, because those kind of pair together, whereas flow and feeling better pair together. And then the one that's most important to me is less meaningful experiences in life when we don't have the ability to stay present for them. And according to a massive study done through UC Berkeley, we're not present 47% of the time, which includes 50% of the time at work. And like basically half the people on this call probably aren't paying attention right now. But
well, we just lost a panelist, so maybe 33% of us.
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting about that is what they found essentially was no matter what you're thinking about, positive, negative, scary, happy, you're never as happy as if you were present in the moment. So as we're gradually losing our ability to stay present in the moment, we are also losing our ability to have meaningful and enjoyable experiences in life, let alone just be productive at work.
And it feels like the first step is acknowledging that this is true. It's for me at least. I'll show you my first, interruption. Come here. Say hi. Okay. Goodbye.
Awesome.
We have to acknowledge that this is really a thing, though. I mean, for me, for so long, until honestly, that when we had this conversation, Jason, and this kind of hit me smack in the face. It's like mindfulness and being in the moment and being present, paying attention, right? In my experience, mindfulness practice is not just like zoning out. It's I'm not tired or anything. It's just I'm really paying attention. I always had it reserved for my personal life, and that was in my personal life bucket. After we started talking through this, I really was like, I'm spending 40% of my waking existence working, right? Why is this attention where it's this spring of creativity, like real design, like you're able to in decision making, you're able to see, like you're not in a tunnel, like you're able to see all of these other factors if you're really paying attention.
Yep.
I had it reserved with work for so long. But the first step for me is acknowledging that it's not just that. This is a real problem, and it should be a real high priority for me.
Yeah, we've got a comment in the chat on this point. Awareness is important, but not good enough if you don't take action. So we're definitely going to hit on that. We had somebody share, they were at a luncheon when a person was having a lot of physical symptoms and realized it was burnout. We see people working with frenetic energy and seeing it as being positive. And
we'll address that when we get to flow.
Awesome. And then a couple comments on thinking about how each of you manage your work. So everybody, thanks for putting some thoughts in the chat. Jason, we want to tee this one up and then I'll play the video.
Yeah. So we want to introduce some information around dopamine, kind of to help explain why we're so prone and drawn to distractions. So I mean, we'll just get into the video and we can talk about it after, but this is going to help explain why we're so.
Depending on how you use it, the internet can also elevate dopamine to unnatural levels. This is because the internet is a novelty machine, something dopamine is particularly reactive to. We are wired to crave new information, and new information is interpreted like a reward. If we weren't curious about new things, we wouldn't find new sources of water, food, or shelter. This novelty is why it's so easy to find yourself scrolling through social media websites, swiping through apps like Imgur or Tinder, and clicking through Reddit for way longer than you intended. Each of these reward you with some level of novelty for a very easy behavior: scroll, swipe, or click. Like the monkey reacting to the light switch and getting a rise in dopamine, which motivates him to press a lever, your brain interprets your smartphone as if you were in a specific environment where moving your thumb gives you the reward of new information. So being in that environment acts as a cue, which stimulates dopamine release and your thumb moves. But it doesn't end. You can still swipe for the chance to get another cool picture, so your dopamine remains elevated. This never-ending novelty is what leads to the abnormal elevation of dopamine. Ironically, the aspect of this that raises dopamine the most is that you might get an interesting piece of information. As Robert Sapolsky explains, With monkeys, if you go from light goes on, push lever, get reward, to light goes on, push lever, maybe get reward, you get a much higher dopamine rise. Every swipe means maybe you'll see something funny or interesting. The first 10 tweets on Twitter might be boring, but the 11th one might be something good, and that keeps you going.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So important to note, dopamine is played upon by some of the most addicting drugs in the world. And the reason that drugs are addicting is they kind of create novelty when you're in the state that the drug puts you in. So if you're taking whatever street drug you're into taking, if that's your thing, it's making the things that you're doing more interesting because they seem newer. It's increasing the novelty of everything around you. So that's increasing the dopamine, which is, and they're also playing on the doping, which is, creating that novelty. Anyway, that's what's helping make them addictive. So we have this type of novelty at our fingertips, in our pocket, all day long, every day. And if anybody is fooling themselves into thinking that they're not prone to being addicted to it, then they're just kidding themselves.
Well, the interesting thing with this audience, Jason, is like some of them might be making the gamification tools or the technologies that do these distractions, which I remember we were listening to a podcast that around 11,000 engineers' full-time job is to distract us with these dopamine spiking things, right? So what do we do?
I mean, this is probably old news for people on this call. But the why we want to bring this up is to relate it back to what we're going to talk about in a second here, which is flow and how it is in direct competition with flow triggers and how it just makes us more susceptible to distraction, but negatively impacts our long-term productivity. So this constant access to dopamine diminishes motivation towards other productive activities, worsens our impulse control, and undermines the effectiveness of flow triggers, because flow triggers work by stimulating dopamine, which is going to help enhance our attention and pattern recognition. But now that flow trigger is going to be in direct competition with this super easy and constant dopamine that we can get just by touching our phones. So even if we are doing the flow triggers, correctly, they're not going to be as strong of a direction into flow because they're in competition with other ways to get dopamine. And the dopamine that we used to get from completing tasks that were on our to-do list and we feel productive afterwards, now though that dopamine is also in direct competition with the super low cost way to receive dopamine. So that's going to lead to diminished motivation in the long term. So essentially we're becoming more used to seeking easy short-term rewards and putting long-term productivity and accomplishment at risk. And so that's why this dopamine mechanism is important to pay attention to. It isn't, we'll get into it when we get to practical steps, but essentially these easy ways to get dopamine should be thought of as like junk food for your brain. And you just don't want to all the time.
There's a reactive part of it too. We talked about the proactive and going and opening my phone and going to TikTok and starting to swipe. There's the notification gauntlet that I'm surrounded by. Right? There's Slack, there's Teams, there's like several Slack channels. There's my phone. There's multi. There's all of these channels. By device too. Which I would imagine. That notification and my reactive experience to that notification kind of prompts me to proactively go and learn something new. I would assume, Jason, right?
Yeah. We'll talk about more about that in the next group of slides, because we're moving on. We've kind of stated what the problem is, why it's a problem, how it's facilitated, and now we're going to go into more of the positive end of the talk where we drive home some solutions.
All right, so you've said some interesting words. I'd love for you to teach some key terms here for the group so that for the rest of the presentation they know what we're talking about.
Yeah, let's just put them all up so that I can see them. So a couple of these terms are promoted by this author, Cal Newport. So if anybody's familiar with him, they're probably familiar with some of these terms. But deep work versus shallow work, we're wanting to separate deep work, which will be cognitively challenging work done while undistracted, versus less challenging work done probably while distracted. And the deep work is going to refer more to moving the needle, adding value to the company or your project, learning new skills, creating things that would have otherwise not been created, versus shallow work is like creating invoices, changing fonts on PowerPoints, more administrative and logistical things. So if we want to prioritize deep work, and it's not that there's like one that's morally better than the other, you need both for the business function, but if you're not doing any deep work, then the needle just kind of isn't moving. You're very stagnant. So slow productivity is the concept that we are going to get better quality work done if we work on fewer things and have a sustainable pace at which to work on those things, which is obviously the opposite of our story that we told in the beginning, where we, gave our examples that a lot of people were resonating with. So to get slow productivity, you need to get deep work done at regular intervals over time. And the preferable way to be working deeply is to be in flow. So flow is going to be our cognitive state of peak performance. And we'll talk more about that in the next few slides. But if we can get scheduled work blocks to do deep work and then be in flow during them, then we can really ramp up productivity. And this is going to require no distractions happening, by definition, for it to be flow and deep work. And then attention deficit trait, we've talked about. Attention residue, we touched on briefly, but that's going to be the time it takes to recover your level of focus after getting distracted or interrupted.
Awesome. Feel free, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. This is a lot of new terminology. Some of you may have seen podcasts, some of you have attended sessions. So what is flow? What are we here to talk about now to get people out of distraction and into flow?
Well, so if distractions are slowing us down and increasing our stress and reducing productivity, then flow is basically the opposite. So it's defined as the optimal state of consciousness, a state where you feel your best and perform your best. And it's the total immersion in the present moment and the task at hand, resulting in better productivity and much lower stress than if you were to be doing that while distracted.
John, when do you get into flow?
Not when I'm surfing. I wish that were the case. More recently, I got into flow when I did a lot of work to create a flow block. But it took a lot of planning and preparation, mostly because I'm just starting to taking this seriously now, and I'm starting to actively do this. That's a very good question, Josh. It took a lot of work and preparation and thought, and I'm going to continue improving upon it, because I had to look at each one of my devices and then communication channels and alert channels. I had to set expectations for that block with multiple clients that I'm working with right now. I had to schedule that block in an interval that I knew would leave me at my home office by myself. It took a lot of work. It took some prioritization of channels, some real honesty around myself, starting to become more comfortable with, I think it was Chris, if I screw up your name, I forgot it, my bad. But saying no, it's okay to say no, and for me, it's my personality. I think probably it's sometimes hard for me to say no, and I want to walk away from the day with every one of my inboxes at zero. I want all of the client expectations are through the roof. I want to walk away from my day and have this clean cut where I can transition to my personal life, which is not, it sounds reasonable, or it has sounded reasonable to me. It's not. I have to become comfortable with some people out there in the world professionally being, to some degree, disappointed with me. That's okay. It is okay, as long as the ways in which I'm disappointing them are professional, appropriate, but also that they're in line with an honest appraisal of what my team's priorities are. But it took a lot of work, and I was able to get in there. And after everything that Jason talks through, and I'll shut up now because we'll get into it, rang true. The time it took to get there, when I was pulled out of it by some distraction, the time that it took to get back, everything was true. in my experience, and it was like a nice 2.5 hour flow block. So thanks for asking, Kate.
Awesome. Well, we have a question in the chat that we're going to address on how to not be the one distracting your team, which came up the first time we ever ran the session. So we'll get to that in a minute. As if
I'll do it now, because the response was spot on by Serena. So just as like everybody's situation and workflow and who you're working with and where you are, and that's all going to be different. But in general, Serena was spot on. Creating to-do lists or clear goals lists is another term for the same idea, is super key. But it's part of like a bigger matrix. So you're gonna have your long-term goals, which your deep work is aiming towards, your slow productivity is aiming towards, and you carve down those longer term goals into like your monthly or weekly priorities. And from your weekly priorities, you're going to have daily clear goals list or to-do lists. And then within your day, you're going to hopefully have a scheduled, or at least a couple per week, but a couple scheduled flow blocks or just undistracted work blocks in which you can cover ground on your clear goals list for the day. And then and we'll get into this, but you're doing sequential processing rather than multitasking. So you write out ahead of time what order you're going to complete these tasks in. You work on one until it's complete, and then you move on to the next. And so as a Scrum Master, allowing people the autonomy and the time to have a flow block where they're not expected to respond to emails, super quickly. So setting expectations that allow for a little more autonomy, that allow for flow blocks, that set people up with their weekly priorities, that allow them to carve out time to work on their daily clear goals list. All of those things kind of work in concert to get people a little more motivated, a little more focused, and a little more productive.
Awesome. So what's happening when we're in flow?
We're getting all the good stuff. So the flow is facilitated by the release of powerful performance enhancing and feel good neurochemicals. And there's also a decrease in activity in the prefrontal cortex, which leads to a lot of the attributes that we experience during flow. And this is essentially just a resource allocation by our brains to stimulate our best efforts, which leads to heightened motivation, creativity, and learning. So it's just our brains feeling that there's something important enough to allocate a lot of resources to, and it's gonna release the enhancing chemicals, and it's gonna shut down prefrontal cortex, which is gonna kind of be in charge of our sense of time. So this is where time dilation, time can speed up. All of a sudden you're like, oh wow, 2.5 hours went by. Or sense of self is kind of vanishing, which means your inner critic isn't jabbering away like, oh, that's a bad idea. So-and-so will think this about it. It'll be embarrassing if it doesn't work out. Like that thing is gone. So now creativity is really allowed to ramp up because you're not double thinking everything, every decision. You just have access to all of your wells of information, all pattern recognition, and you can pull from anywhere without hesitation.
So what happens when we overload? This one is my favorite to talk about. Like I never thought about cognitive load until we started 5 to Flow and working with teams and kind of equating it to how this team makes fun of me for having too many tabs open on my Chrome. And I've got like all this stuff I'm working on, Slack pinging, all these things pinging at me. What's happening during that?
Right. So, cognitive load is just our working memory. So like the RAM on your computer, or for the less tech savvy people, I just kind of equate it to like tabs open on your computer. The more you have open, the more you start losing track of what everything is, where it is, and it's harder to keep track. And then you're slower at accessing all that information. So your error rate increases, decision making is more difficult, more prone to overwhelm and stress. And in order to have the most cognitive resources allocated to a task, which would be flow, we can't be splitting those resources up amongst a bunch of distractions or multitasking things. That's pretty much it. It's pretty simple. The more you're trying to hold on to, the worse your brain works. The less you're holding on to, the more your brain can hone in and just be at its best on that one thing.
Awesome.
So this slide is talking about how our brains are serial processors. They're not you can't truly multitask, not on a complicated thing. You can like drive and talk on the phone, but at that point, driving is like second nature to you, or you can like chew gum and walk. Those things are not complex tasks. Once we're doing complex tasks, especially problem solving tasks, we're only capable of task switching. And this task switching costs us time to recover our focus, and it's way more mentally exhausting than if we were to just focus on one thing at a time and move through sequential processing. So a little narrative to kind of wrap up a lot of the things we've talked about up to this point is, if flow is going to take 15 minutes of uninterrupted focus on a task or sequence of tasks before we really get into a flow state, and not until about 45 minutes until we're at our peak level of flow and productivity, versus 3 minutes before task switching, or 11 minutes on a task before being distracted by an outside source, plus our 25 minutes of attention residue every time one of those things happens. When are we ever getting to this level of productivity that we're capable of getting to? Probably not that often. We're essentially spending our whole day in this state of continuous partial attention, which is just not going to be optimal if we want to get the most productivity for the least amount of stress out of ourselves.
Awesome. So we've got a lot of questions on what to do about it. A lot of people interacting on some additional questions I want to make sure we get to. So let's think about how we move from this average knowledge worker's feelings and productivity to a worker in flow. Some of the tips, maybe anyone on the chat, feel free to put some of your ideas in here from this right column. Jason, you want to hit the highlights on these, or John chime in on some of the, like Tracy asked, how long it took you to redo your process. Some of the things on the right there, you think you've put into place and we saw in the chat already that helped you?
I've made a beginning. It took me probably 4 hours to put a framework together for what I was going to do and what my plan was going to be. And then to communicate to those in my daily life, professional life, but also talked to my wife about it briefly. She kind of just was like, whatever. But to communicate that, to establish it, to set those times, and to manage my devices and notifications, but to come up with the priority order, a combination of device and channel. So like, and client, actually, it turned out it took a bit to get me to that point. And it's a beginning, because I noticed it seemed like about 30 minutes until I was really in a state where I felt present. But now as I reflect on it, it may have been another 15 or 20 minutes. And I know that having done it probably 4 or 5 times, each time I've learned something new about the experience, about myself. So it's certainly a work in progress, but thus far, like the tangible outputs of those times have been of value, and some things that I would have overlooked as I'm in this light load kind of approach, where it should be more task oriented. I would have overlooked some considerations that I learned, at least for one of the decisions that I made, could have been really impactful, like pushed a feature release by like maybe a full sprint.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, so one of the things we get asked a lot, and the question in the chat around running your teams, I think is an interesting one, where we may feel kind of handcuffed, which we'll talk about on the next slide about what you can do for just yourself, but like what of this needs to be at a team level or a company level. So like companies that allow breaks to make sure you can recharge, or like that we know how often we check email, what Slack is to be used for. So 5 to Flow, we actually set use cases and service level agreements for types of communications, and making sure that as smaller teams, we know when that uninterrupted work time is. And then we'll always get the question about emergencies. So Jason, any more thoughts on this, or anyone have comments in the Q&A for these before we move to your?
Yeah, I wanted to just hit on some of the comments real quick. Josh was asking about balancing the social need and versus minimizing distraction. And I mean, that's a perfect question to set up some of our answers here. But essentially, if you're trying to create more productivity, like separate out the social need component for that block of time, right? Notifications off. So managing notifications is a huge one, and being empowered to manage your notifications by your superiors and managers and whatnot is huge. But then when you're actually in a social situation, not being distracted by other things, so that you're actually focused on the social interaction that you're dealing with, right? So that's super important as well. So and that's what we talked about with the stat around less meaningful interactions, right? If we're not present half of the time, then that need for social interaction is not being met, because you're only getting 50% of all the social interaction that you're actually taking part of, right? So increasing our ability to pay attention by not being distracted during our work block actually doubles up in terms of your ability to stay focused when you're having a social interaction, right? So you're getting benefit on both ends. And part of that is batch checking emails, setting work blocks that are uninterrupted, and managing notifications during all of this. Like, all of these are going to contribute to both the productivity and the social component.
Yep. We need there's science behind that too, and getting out of ourselves, and being with others, and that's and the benefits of that. I just want to touch on real quick. There's been several comments to this, and whether you call it an Agile working contract or an Agile agreement or a team agreement and all that stuff, I've used that for years, right? I forget where I got the first template. It was like forever ago. But those agreements have been, in my experience, absolutely crucial to every team that I've been on, every single time, without exception, establishing those, but then also going back to those, reminding the team and a PO and stakeholders what we all agreed to, as a pleasant, polite reminder when they, throw some garbage, over the fence. But I guess what's important, though, what's important for me, is those agreements make sense, but it's first selling. We shouldn't need to sell. Selling the people on your team and a PO and a stakeholder and all that stuff on this. And it goes to another question too: will the deck and PDF be available? The short answer is yes. It's available to you. But Jason and Kate and I, in terms of that selling process, if it is difficult, which frankly it shouldn't be, to sell this and establish value and rationale for putting these flow blocks together, so you can start to work this way, we are happy to help you. We love this stuff. So,
well, I think these practical strategies, Jason, that you wrote up for us are super interesting. I'm just going to put them all up to make sure we get through all of them. Why don't we hit some of the highlights, which we've already kind of talked about some of these.
Yeah, so I mean, just to put the slide into context, the previous slide was more what is specific to like a work context. This is more my version of how you approach life, your mindset, and how those can create better results for yourself. So like, one is, set, calendar, partitions and whatnot. And this one is more like how you approach things in your life. So delaying gratification is a huge way to rectify this lack of impulse control that's going to happen by getting bombarded with dopamine stimulation all day. So simple things like just practicing performing one productive task as a prerequisite before fulfilling an impulsive desire. Super simple example, take out the trash before having ice cream. This is basically what everybody used to make their kids do. And now that we're all adults and we have smartphones, we've totally forgotten that this is like an important factor for long-term success, is delaying gratification. But this is really good at being an antidote for some of the things that happen when we lose our ability to pay attention. So that's one. Practice unit tasking and sequential processing. We've talked about this a little bit, but this helps us learn, again, to pay attention to one thing at a time, follow it through to the end, and then move on So clear goals list or to-do list really helped this a lot. Also, just engaging in long form content rather than quick hitting content, like listen to a 3-hour podcast, watch a full movie, do all of the dishes, do it all without being on your phone. And that's going to contribute to your attention span. Sitting down and reading is a good way to judge your attention span. If you're getting kind of fidgety and anxious after a few minutes, not a very good attention span, maybe 20, 30 minutes, that's okay. But if you can sit down for 2 hours and enjoy a book, that's a strong attention span. But that is increasingly less, the average, especially in tech-heavy work environments. The last one John talked about earlier, being organized and intentional, being purposeful with your time and attention. So know what you're going to do ahead of time and go do it, rather than leaving yourself in the position of having to react to tasks, impulses, or boredom. So inbox batching is a good one here. For those that don't know, that's just maybe 2 or 3 times a day, you spend 20, 30 minutes going through inbox, clearing it out, rather than waiting for notifications to trickle in and then like responding and reacting to those notifications. Have dedicated times to where you whip through all your inboxes. Clear goals, as we talked about. Power down rituals, that's at the end of your day. Setting priorities and clear goals for the next day, wrapping up any loose ends for that day. This helps lower your cognitive load going to the evening, allowing you to get rest and rebuild all those neurochemicals so that you come back and perform at your best the next day. Keep your work area clean and consistent, free of distracting sights and sounds, and targeted use of technology rather than scrolling to avoid boredom. So simple example here is I have some free time, I'm bored, I could go on social media or YouTube and scroll and see if something interests me, and then I'll click on it. But as I'm scrolling, I'm just raking in junk food for the brain and dopamine and whatnot. Or I could spend 30 seconds ahead of time, think about what I might want to go engage in on my phone, use the phone as a tool to get to that thing, and then go, entertain myself or learn about that one thing. So just simple step like that. What do I want to use my phone for ahead of time? Then go use it. That can make a huge difference in terms of avoiding these, needless rabbit holes that just suck your attention span.
Right.
Jason,
Well, in three minutes or less. Sorry, John, we got 3 minutes. What you got?
no, it's just I want to set expectations with the group, and I want to validate this with you, Jason. I mean, we're talking about the environment in which we've lived for previous history. I know that when our brains become accustomed to these sorts of patterns of gratification and behavior and frequency and all this stuff, our brains do change, right? So I guess it's more. I think it's a question. I think I already know the answer to it. Like, this probably for me is not going to be an overnight thing. This is something where my brain has changed and is expecting of notifications, and there's all these dopamine. The receptors are looking for gratification, and I probably physiologically I'm going to have to give myself some time in repeating these behavioral changes, and be patient with myself.
Yep.
Yeah, so I think the key thing there is growth mindset, which essentially means learn from your failures. Don't take them as evidence that this is an impossible task, right? Like, it's going to be hard. You can't just jump into a 3-hour flow block if you're not set up for success. Like, you may start out with a 20 or 30 minute uninterrupted work block because that's all you can manage for your schedule, and that's all your attention span can manage in the beginning, and you can build on that. And in the practical work environment, asking for 3 hours uninterrupted is probably unrealistic. But the more that you show good quality work coming out of your uninterrupted work blocks, the more leniency and the more room you get to have that autonomy to get those work blocks, because you're now trusted as a quality producer. You're like, wow, like if I give that person time and a task to do, like they'll knock it out with high quality. So I'm going to go do that.
Yeah.
So you roll into it, you build into it, you use your failures to learn from.
Totally agree. So closing thoughts, I'm super curious from everyone, like what you just said. And when you think about like anything you do training for incrementally, like training for a marathon, you start small, grow over time, going on a diet, lose a couple pounds a week, have some plateaus. What do each of you see potential for? Like, if you see high quality coming out of your teams that are less distracted, or from yourself, or fewer errors, better scoping, love to see what your thoughts are. And to John's point, we are going to send this out. So we'd love everybody from a takeaway perspective. to think how you can use this knowledge to better manage your day and your teams now. That was one of the key questions from the group, and anything you might start doing differently or stop doing. I know one of our first clients who saw this session said, oh my God, I'm the one distracting my team. So what role you play is so important. And then we want to make sure that we help you along the way. So we'll send these links out to everybody who's registered and make sure you have access to these tools long term. I know we're right at time, but thanks, Tracy, for your final comment there. Absolutely unlearn some of these behaviors. Any other closing thoughts, Jason or John, from you or anyone else want to ask anything in the chat?
Grateful for everyone's time. And thanks for your time, Jason and Kate.
Yeah, I think I rapidly said all the thoughts I have over the last hour, so I'm good.
Well, we kept all 26 of you through the entire hour. Hopefully it was undistracted, immersed, and that you feel like you have some tools, some changes you can make. Love to hear from all of you as we go. John, website quickly, is it justacellas.com?
This is ACELLAS.com, especially if you got Salesforce and it drives you nuts.
Awesome. And we're at 5toflow.com. We have a survey where we can benchmark your health and would love to make sure you have access to all these tools and resources. Jason, any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say that because we only briefly touched on the flow stuff today. And if you want to look at how to better enhance flow triggers and apply it to your work or your life, there's 10 or 12 blogs on the 5toflow website that I've written about flow and how to apply it to your life and your business. So you can go check those out if you're interested to learn more about flow, since we didn't deep dive into it today.
Thanks so much, everybody, for your time. John, thank you for sponsoring this event. We're so grateful for you. Have a wonderful rest of your time at the Agile Summit. Everyone, sorry we went over by a couple minutes, but glad you stayed on, and we'll see you again soon on another event. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.